right? So the way we can talk about it in some ways is obviously what you have going on here, or obviously to me in some ways, is the issue of white supremacy, but there wasn't that language to describe, right, what's happening at the time. That wasn't part of the common language. Instead, what you have at this moment is people's first familiarity with the Darwinian idea of evolution, right? This is around the time that Darwin's ideas of evolution have been published. And in that context, you had British researchers creating this ape-like Irishman who was likened to what were considered these lesser races in Africa at the time, right? So you get outdated language used to refer to the Black individual on the right-hand side of the image, who is very stereotypically depicted, right? And so then if you think about that Black figure that you see on the right-hand side of the image, and then you look at I think it's the middle image that's the British guy, and then the left-hand side is the Irish face. What are some of the things that stand out to you about the depictions of those Irish and British faces in that image?
I mean, just like physical features wise, the two on the outsides are more like longer, like from front to back, and the one in the middle is more like upright. If that makes, like, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's the kind of physical depiction on the page, right, which is a great observation of the shape of their heads, right? This is a period when people are interested in phrenology too, right? All the bumps on your skull and what we can tell about you supposedly from that. What else?
I mean, the everyone but the English picture is almost like a caricature.
Yeah.
And the one that's drawn to be an Englishman is designed to look like almost something that you could like relate to. As like if you're reading this paper as someone in England, you're supposed to see yourself in that picture and see like an other in the other two pictures. It's like they're drawn to look different from how we know like people look, and then the English one is supposed to drawn to look relatable, quote unquote, to an Englishman at the time.
Yeah, that's a great observation, and that's absolutely accurate, right? This idea that you have this kind of othering of the Irish and the African figure to set them apart from the British. And the other thing you can see in the British figure, right, is it looks more like what we're used to seeing in classical statues of like Greek and Roman figures, right? It has that kind of, gets referred to as the Roman nose, right? It has all of those characteristics that tie that figure to what was kind of prioritized as kind of great culture and great history, and this kind of, again, Greco-Roman tradition that was viewed as somehow better, right, than the background of the Irish. So based on these kind of racist writings in the 19th century from anatomists at the time, you ended up with people writing things like, and this is going to use racialized anachronistic language that we don't use now. They would describe the Irish as an absolutely negroid type has been occasionally detected by keen observers. Inferior and non-Aryan racial elements are clearly perceptible in the population of the Sister Isle, right? So we have incredibly racist language being used to talk about the Irish. And this was done because then you had the sense that the Irish could only be bettered or civilized by becoming culturally, and in this argument, actually literally more English, right? This was an argument for some anatomists at the time actually made the argument that the Irish needed to intermarry with the English in order to make the Irish race more civilized, right? So incredibly problematic racist arguments.
Wow.
And ultimately this got used because whenever the English needed to kind of extend their authority, control more territory, claim more of the land in Ireland, then they would reference this supposed barbarism and savagery, or even the alleged paganism of the Irish as a justification for suppression. So this all adds up to a rationalization by the British for colonial subjugation, for violence whenever the Irish began to rebel, for usurping Irish resources, and basically a rejection of anything that would challenge the boundaries or the economies of the British Empire. Right? It was important to Britain to hold on to its colonial lands because these were sources of revenue for the British Empire. They had something at stake economically and keeping control of Ireland. So the reason that I start with that and that I ask us to kind of keep that in mind is because I want to highlight the idea that when you're talking about Ireland, you have a strong culture that is used to being kind of the object and the recipient of prejudice based on that colonial history, right? So it's a very different history and legacy of prejudice in some ways than what we see in the States around the legacy of slavery. But in many ways, Irish culture kind of formed itself in response or in opposition to all of these negative English stereotypes that you see in these quotes and that you see in that image, right? So that's really in part what some of this is responding to. So I want you to have that in the back of your mind when I talk about the Irish National Theatre Company. And so we can't reduce, right? Everything can't be a response to the colonial nature of Ireland, but those racial politics are really deeply tied to the National Theatre Project. So, how is all of it actually tied together? Up until the point that I'm going to talk about in more detail, theatre in Ireland was largely a British import, right? So the famous playwrights were what's called Anglo-Irish. They were of Protestant English background living in Ireland. So while you have a history of theatre in Ireland well before the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, what we hear about and what we read is largely British theatre. And often that theatre was literally kind of picked up wholesale from London and put down quite literally in Dublin, sometimes using the same acting troupes, etc. So you had kind of British theatre on the Irish stage in Dublin. So what that means is that up to this point, the image of the Irishman that you often had on stage is what in literary criticism gets called the stage Irish, right? So it's a parody or a satire of an Irish figure. And so that L.P. Curtis study that I mentioned before says he was usually a feckless, devil-may-care, rollicking, hard-drinking, and hard-fighting peasant who posed a more serious threat to himself and those whom he lived with than to Anglo-Irish landlords and English officials, right? So this image of a buffoon, this image of someone who isn't really effective even in trying to rebel. When you think about images of like the fighting Irish or the paddy, like this has even come into our language when if you hear slang like the reference to a paddy wagon or a police vehicle, that's a reference to these stereotypes of Irishness, right? So these are persistent, these have been around. And so at the end of the 19th century in 1882, you have Yeats founding a national literary society. And their purpose was really to publicize the literature, the legends, the folklore of Ireland. And so as part of that, they found the Irish National Theatre. Here's what I want you to think about though. They call it the Irish National Theatre. And this is at the end of the 18th century. So if you think back to some of the history you went over, was it yesterday, Lauren, or the day before?
Yesterday.
Yesterday. Think about the end of the 19th century and think about what might be weird or interesting about calling it an Irish National Theatre.
Do you guys remember what Mr. Mathis said was happening at the end of the 19th century in Ireland?
Is that when they broke off into the Republic and the Republic of Northern Ireland?
Yes,
It wasn't like
we're
It
getting
wasn't
there.
one nation, really, or what it wasn't going to be.
I'm not
Yeah,
sure what
so we're
Elizabeth
like-
heard, but
We're maybe 10 years before that, right? But you're on the right track. You're exactly thinking of it in those political terms, right? There is no Irish nation at this point, right? So end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, Ireland is still part of the British Empire. Partition hasn't happened yet. They haven't split into Northern Ireland and Ireland, but there's literally no nation, right? So calling it an Irish National Theatre itself is in some ways an active rebellion in this moment. So when you call something an Irish National Theatre, what sort of connotations does that give you? What do you think it means when you hear that phrase, Irish National Theatre?
Represents all of Ireland.
Represents what?
All of Ireland.
Yeah, right? That idea of something that can be representative of all of Ireland. Any other ideas?
That they are in fact a nation.
That they all reflect the nation?
That they are a nation.
Oh, that they are a nation. Yeah, yeah. So it's that, again, that political claiming of national identity, right? Claiming of something that is Irish distinct from Britain, right? So the literary movement of the Irish revival is strongly aligned with political nationalism. And part of the reason it's called a revival is because as part of British colonialism, you weren't allowed to speak Irish, you weren't allowed, if you were Catholic, you weren't allowed to own land for a long time, you couldn't attend certain schools. So it was considered kind of a revival of Irish folklore, and there was a separate kind of revival of the Irish language itself. So literature at this point is really deeply invested in concepts of Irishness, right? What is it? What is and isn't suitably Irish? What does Irish literature focus on? What can it focus on? What should it focus on in proclaiming a national literature? So Yeats, who's one of the main figures of this, believed folklore could play a crucial role in inspiring creative work for the Irish revival and would promote a distinctively Irish racial and cultural mythology in opposition to England, right? So he wrote a manifesto when he started the theater company, and this is what he said. We propose to have performed in Dublin in the spring of every year certain Celtic and Irish plays which, whatever be their degree of excellence, will be written with a high ambition, and so to build up a Celtic and Irish school of dramatic literature. We hope to find in Ireland an uncorruptive and imaginative audience trained to listen by its passion for oratory, and believe that our desire to bring upon the stage the deeper thoughts and emotions of Ireland will ensure for us a tolerant welcome, and that freedom to experiment which is not found in theaters of England, and without which no new movement in art or literature can succeed. We must know that Ireland is not the home of the flittery and of easy sentiment, as it has been represented, but the home of an ancient idealism. We are confident of the support of all Irish people who are weary of misrepresentation in carrying out a work that is outside all the political questions that divide us. So he's arguing that it's not political, but I would argue that it's absolutely political, right? This is the idea of setting forward an image of Ireland that people can be proud of, right? So when you think about nationalism in this sense, it's not nationalism in the way that that word gets used kind of currently. It's nationalism in the sense of really advocating for a sovereign Ireland. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk briefly about what are perhaps kind of two of the most famous plays that were staged by the Irish National Theatre around this time. The first is by W.B. Yeats, it's called Kathleen Ni Houlihan, and the second is by J.M. Singh, it's called Playboy of the Western World. Neither of the plays were explicitly written to be, right, this idea of socio-political theater. They weren't written explicitly as political pieces. But I think hopefully you'll be able to see as I talk about them some of the ways in which they function as part of what we could see as this kind of theater of rebellion at the time. So Kathleen Ni Houlihan was first performed in 1902, so we're in the 20th century now. And it's set in one of the westernmost counties of Ireland in the year of 1798. I don't know if, Lauren, did you guys talk about the various rebellions in Ireland?
We had an hour to get through what I think Gordon basically decided would be all of Irish history, focusing on Irish and English interactions. So I think a refresher could be handy if you can do it quickly.
Awesome. Okay. So in 1798, you had a famous rebellion where the French landed in the west of Ireland. They were supposed to help the Irish rise up against the British. They didn't send as many people. There was trouble. It failed miserably, right? That's the 2-second version. It led directly to the Act of Union in 1800 that abolished the Irish Parliament and fully brought Ireland under British rule. So it was really bad for the Irish nationalists. And so Yeats sets the play in the west of Ireland in the village where the French were supposed to land in the year of 1798, just before this rebellion happens. And just before the play had been written and performed, he had played a major role in organizing the commemoration of those who died in 1798. So here's a quick plot synopsis. You have a poor peasant family who's in their home. They're preparing for their older son's wedding. He's just brought home a dowry, right, a payment he's receiving from her family. And they're really concerned with pragmatic things, right? Money, land, his clothes. So we're in this moment of theatrical realism. Everything happening on the stage could be things that would be happening in the lives of any peasant family in Ireland in 1798, right? So when we start, history is outside the cottage, but it's about to kind of break in and disrupt the order of things. So then Kathleen enters. So you have an image, the second image I sent you, which is a photograph of a stage production, has a few characters in it. Can you all see that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So that's an image of a woman named Maud Gunn. She's on the right-hand side of the image, playing the title role of Kathleen. Yeats, in many ways, actually wrote the play for her. He was in love with her for much of his life. He proposed to her twice. He actually proposed to her daughter once. They all always said no. He wrote to her for decades. He would send her a lot of his poems before they were published. His most famous poem he sent to her before it was published, and she wrote him back and said, "No, I don't like your poem." So she was someone who was a major figure in his life, and with whom he debated Irish politics and nationalism. She was an active political nationalist. She was tall, she was striking, kind of commanding presence on the stage. And so for Yeats, she was kind of the embodiment of Ireland, right? So when you look at the image that you have, just at kind of a literal level, what do you see happening in that image?
Everyone's reacting to something that the woman who's playing Kathleen is doing.
Everyone's reacting to her?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep, what else?
It kind of looks like she has the power in the
Okay.
scene.
Based on sort of how she's staged, right?
What was
If
that?
you
Zoe?
look like she's standing and looking towards the audience and they're mostly seated or shorter than her, right? She takes up the most kind of physical space on stage in that moment as well. Anything else?
They're dressed like they're in tattered clothes, or like
They're dressed how?
like more or like on the
Okay. Lauren, can you, I can't quite hear her.
She said that they're dressed in clothes that look tattered and like they're poor.
Yeah. So you get a sense, this is a peasant family, 1798, you get a sense of their poverty and you get a sense of Kathleen who has come in. So over the course of the play, Kathleen Ni Houlihan comes to symbolize Ireland, okay? Part of that is the name itself. Kathleen Ni Houlihan would have been familiar as a figure to everybody who went to see this play when it was originally staged as a representation of Ireland. She also gets called the Shan Van Bocht, the poor old woman, right? And at this time, you frequently had England and Ireland portrayed in political cartoons as women, right? So you had Hibernia for Ireland, Britannia is England. Britannia was often in Greco-Roman armor. Hibernia is this kind of impoverished looking woman in need of support and defending, right? So in some ways, this is shifting and adapting that image, right, of Irishness. Kathleen is commanding, she takes up the most space, everything is focused on her. And so when Kathleen enters, the whole play shifts, and you get this moment where the supernatural comes in. So you get an exchange like this. Michael, the main male figure who's supposed to get married, asks her, "What hopes have you to hold to?" And she replies, "The hope of getting my beautiful fields back again, the hope of putting the strangers out of my house," right? So all of her lines in the play have double meaning, right? We can read that literally, the hope of getting my beautiful fields back again, the hope of putting the strangers out of my house. We can think about a physical house and land that she's lost control of. But anyone Irish watching the play at the time would have known exactly what this meant. And what it meant was those 4 green fields are the 4 provinces of Ireland, the strangers are the British, right? So she comes in as this figure who's calling for the British to be forced out of Ireland and for Ireland to come back to itself again. So at the end of the play, Michael abandons his fiancée and his family to go and fight for Kathleen in the 1798 rebellion. I mentioned a minute ago it was a complete failure. So again, the audience would know that he's going out to his death, right? Anybody watching this in 1902 when it was staged would know that that's what's going to happen. And yet that's exactly the point, right? We all know what's going to happen, and yet the play is intended to spark this nationalist feeling of being willing to go out and fight for the cause of Irish freedom, right? So you have Kathleen with lines like, "Many that are red-cheeked now will be pale-cheeked. Many that have been free to walk the hills and bogs will be sent to walk hard streets in far countries. Many a child will be born and there will be no father at its christening. And for all that, they will think they are well paid." Right? For all this, even though they're going to go out and die, they will think that they have done this in service of something greater. So a lot of critics see this as Yeats's most assertive, most nationalist political statement. He denies the politics of it. He denied during his lifetime the politics of it. But you had audiences responding and again, writing in the newspapers and saying things like, the effect of Kathleen Houlihan on me was that I went home asking myself if such plays should be produced unless one was prepared for people to go out to shoot and be shot. Yeats was not alone responsible because he co-wrote the play with Lady Gregory. No doubt but that Lady Gregory had helped him to get the peasant speech so perfect. But above all, Miss Gunn's impersonation had stirred the audience as I had never seen another audience stirred, right? So I want you to hold on to that thought, right? That idea that a national theater could be a theater of rebellion that would actually very literally prompt people to go out and fight for Ireland. Because I'm gonna talk just a little bit about another play and then come back to the aftermath of this moment around Kathleen, etc. So 5 years later, Irish National Theatre puts on a play called The Playboy of the Western World. Have any of you heard of this or heard of Sing and Jan Sing? If the answer is no, that's totally fine. It's not usually on high school reading lists. Okay. So Sing was another Irish writer, part of the Irish Literary Revival, and he met up with Yeats, and Yeats said, well, if you really want to write authentically about the Irish peasantry, because neither of them were Irish peasants, you should go live on the Aran Islands, right? You should leave Paris, where all of the kind of fancy people are studying at the time, and go live in the west of Ireland on these remote islands, and you'll learn about the quote-unquote kind of real Irish culture. So Sing did this, and between 1903 and 1908 wrote a number of plays and a book about the Aran Islands, and they're all basically dealing with daily Irish life, and they're mostly inspired by stories that he heard while he was living there. So a lot of his plays are interested in Irish folk beliefs, that this perceived conflict between paganism and Catholicism, in irony, in agency, and in language. And so Yeats decides to stage this play, The Playboy of the Western World. And at its simplest, the plot is basically that once again, we're in a Western peasant location. A woman runs a bar for her father and his friends head off to a funeral, leaving her alone. And a stranger shows up, his name is Christy Mahon, who claims to have killed his father. Right? They're all in awe of his exploits, which is a little weird. But he, over the course of the play, changes from this kind of reticent character into a figure of manliness, right? And obviously I'm glossing over a ton. But then his father shows up. He didn't actually manage to kill him. And he tries again and fails again, and it becomes this kind of comedic parody. And this undercuts the mythology and the story of Christie's manliness that he's created for himself. And so the reason that I want to mention this play to you all is because of what happens when it was first staged, right? We think of theater very often as art, right? As something pleasurable that we go and we see and we do or we study. We don't necessarily often think of it, I think, as sparking literal riots in the streets, but that's what happened when Playboy of the Western World was first staged. At the first performance, hundreds of police had to be called out, right? People were arrested. You couldn't hear the actors on stage because they were booing them. Basically, this stems from the fact that there are a lot of elements of Irish folklore in the play, right? As opposed to a tall tale, it was really received as this kind of true story of Western Ireland. And think back to, right, to that manifesto for the Irish National Theatre that I read you. We will show that Ireland is not the home of buffoonery and easy sentiment, but the home of ancient idealism, right? So audiences went to Playboy expecting an experience like they had with Kathleen Houlihan, right? The mysticism, the beauty of the Irish peasant, the willingness to fight and die for the country. And instead, they're faced with what looked to them an awful lot like a stage Irishman straight out of British colonialism, right? Basically, Irish nationalists felt that the play was an offense to public morals and an insult to Ireland. And as the play went on, they became more and more restless about the absurdities of it. What really offended people, and this sounds kind of almost comical now, is that the figure of Christy Mahon, right? When you hear the name Christy, Christy, what implications does that have? What names do you think of? What other names, what other images do you think of when you hear the name Christy?
Christian, like Christine,
Yep.
I don't know.
Christian. What?
Just Christ.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you had Christy as kind of a Christ figure. You also, in the play, you also had Christy as being modeled on a central and incredibly well-known figure in Irish folklore named Cuchulainn. And in the Cuchulainn tales, you had an epic hero who goes into a battle rage, right? And the only way that they can let him back into the city and that they can figure out how to calm this battle rage is in the folklore, in the epic tale, they send 30 naked women out walking towards him. And because he's so this is so antithetical to his morals, he kind of blushes, looks away, and so the battle rage leaves him and he can be safely amongst the people. Right? So in the play, Christy they sing calls on that, and Christy references women in their ships, which at the time was considered a kind of inappropriate word for women's undergarments. And it was seen as the last straw, and this was the thing that set off the riots, right? Was this depiction of the Irish and of an Irish man who fits that kind of buffoonery and image of the stage Irish. And so critics who've looked at this think about this in terms of, again, that national theater movement and that response to colonialism, that you had an Ireland in 1907 that felt that it was ready to rule itself. And so they expected artists to promote that image of, steady, sober, self-reliant Irish populace. And instead, this is from a famous critic named Declan Kiberd. Instead, with Playboy of the Western World, Synge gave him a play in which a village loon splits his father's head open with a spade, runs away, tells people he killed his dad, is promptly installed as a hero by excitable women and drunken men. Worse still, the drama was staged not in some backstreet art house, but at the Abbey, Ireland's national theatre, one of whose mission statements was to show that Ireland was not the home of the women. Right? So this play kind of repeatedly subverted expectations. And in the aftermath of the Playboy riots, you had local councils passing motions condemning the theater, people feeling that it is as if a mirror were held up to our faces and we found ourselves hideous. We fear to face the thing we scream, right? So now why is all of this important? Basically, I think that this connects to your excursion project and thinking about this theater of rebellion, because it indicates the ways in which politics and self-representation, colonialism and theater are still really tied together when we talk about the theatrical history of Ireland. They're so tied together that Yeats would later write about his worries that his play was responsible for motivating men to go out and fight and die, right? So your historian may have mentioned the Easter 1916 rising that took place. If not, basically that rising in 1916 was another moment when the Irish rebel. It's a failed rebellion. People were actually really upset about it for a while, but then the English made the decision to execute 13 of the leaders of the rising, and they became martyrs to Irish nationalism, and this led into eventually Irish sovereignty. So Yeats, in a poem a year before his death, he writes, "I lie awake night after night and never get the answers right. Did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot?" Right? So he's actually thinking, is my play actually responsible for motivating people to go out and literally fight and die for Ireland? And how do I feel about that as a writer? Right? So we've got this clear tie between art and politics. And there's a contemporary poet named Paul Muldoon who picks up on Yeats's poem I think in the 80s, and writes, as for his craft's rhetorical posturing, did that play of mine send out certain men, the English shot? The answer is certainly not. If Yeats had saved his pencil lead, would certain men have stayed in bed? For history's a twisted root, with art its small translucent fruit, and never the other way around, right? So the debate that Yeats is having with himself and that Muldoon picks up on is about that relationship between literature and politics, right? We could look at plays outside of that context, just look at their literary merits, their qualities, aesthetically. But I think, kind of in what I'm talking about with Dr. Holt, like what you're looking at is a project that's invested in making connections, right, between literary pieces and the historical and cultural moments in which they're being written and performed. So for the Irish National Theatre, and I forgot about, there was a third image of the statue of Cuchulainn that I had included for you, but we can go back and take a look at that at the end if anyone's curious. So in terms of the Irish National Theatre and its moment and its prevalence as a cultural force at the beginning of the 20th century, that leads straight into this moment where the Irish are fighting for home rule and ultimately to become a sovereign nation. So less than 10 years after the riots, the Rising happens in the midst of World War I. It's followed by the Irish War of Independence and the Irish Civil War. And so the imagery from the Irish National Theatre that it plays on in Kathleen and in Playboy is a huge part of what becomes this national mythology of the Irish martyr, who's willing to give his life on behalf of Ireland. And so that's that final picture of the statue that I shared with you. That's a statue of the figure of Cuchulainn, that mythical figure I mentioned, and it was placed in the General Post Office. Believe it or not, the post office was the main site of the Easter Rising in 1916 because it was the seat of government. And that was placed in the post office during the 1930s to commemorate those who were executed by the British for their role in organizing and carrying out the Rising. So hopefully what I'm trying to do here is just tie together what I've been talking about, right? This idea that within Ireland, there's a long-standing tradition of an Irish national theatre that's deeply tied to the national self-image and to Ireland's desire to establish itself as a nation with a politics and a literature and a culture that's on par with England, and to really reject that colonial narrative of racializing the Irish as somehow lesser, right? So we see that in contemporary theater projects that have as part of their mission this kind of distinctly political, ethical aspect. Lauren, are you guys actually going to get to meet with Kibosh?
We're still trying to arrange that. I need to talk to you about it actually later.
I'm hoping you might get to meet with a Northern Irish theater company that does this kind of space-based, place-based theater that's really exciting. But basically, what you have here is playwrights really writing resistance in ways that continue to embody the ideals about what it means to be Irish, who gets to be Irish, and the implications of all of that for our understanding of the significance of Irish theater. So, I know you guys have to go at 1:35. I think it's about 1:30 now, but if there are any questions that you all have, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, hang tight, y'all. Just be patient, just a second. Give yourself a chance to ask questions. I know that it's almost time. We've got 5 minutes till class starts, so just hang tight for a second. Does anybody have any questions or see any connections that they want to draw out between the stuff that we heard yesterday, well, I mean last night, and then what Dr. Chase has shared with us today? Anything, what's on your minds? Yes.
I mean, I wasn't there yesterday, but I think I could see talk about tensions, like throughout England and Ireland, and the history of that. So I guess like these theaters also draw out tensions between the two political, like point of views.
So I said tensions between political points of view and the way that that gets navigated in theatrical spaces. Anything? Yeah. What else is on people's minds at the moment? What are you going to take away?
I mean, just how influential like theater is in these movements, and how like, when we were starting this excursion, I sort of felt like the two would be not separated, but almost independent in some ways, where we're learning about how theater affects movements, and then we're learning about the movement separately. But this shows sort of the intersection where we really don't have to learn about them separately, and they have huge impacts on each other, where it feels like you can't almost have one conversation without the other.
Yeah. Like, I think if you think of it almost like a Venn diagram, like there are ways, there are people who study literature without looking at any of that history, and that's valid. That's not what I do. But so if you think about it, you have these artists struggling with absolutely that idea that like, we tend to think about literature being written in response to historical things. Like we think about the people who wrote about wars after they happened. But you also have this whole sense in which literature is also the thing that confronts political action, right? That these theater companies and these theater movements aren't separate from the politics of what's happening at the time. And I think that's really key.
Yeah. What a wonderful pausing point. So literature as creator of political change. So thank you all for coming. We appreciate your time at lunch today and your attention, and to be continued.
It's making me download. Figure it out.
Ari is doing an independent study with me, and we between the importance of being earnest. Oh my god! Did a presentation on it today, and I felt like I now had a whole new appreciation because of Mr. Mathis' thing yesterday. Yeah, we were talking about it, realizing, oh right, like he moved out of
We
Ireland.
shared your email address.
But he had to leave England
Some of the students
because of all the homosexuality stuff, and
Yeah,
he was in
absolutely.
Paris.
I'll
And
do
so
that.
like he
And
couldn't
thank you
keep
for
creating
coming
these
so
whole
much.
identities.
We appreciate
Yes,
it.
and people would
It
always
was
catch him
really
in these
helpful.
lives.
Yes.
And it was
Tons
like,
of
but
good
how can you?
probably
And
solidified
it's
a
such
lot
a
of stuff
hypocritical,
that
like,
there's
how
still
can you
a
catch me in my
lot.
life when I'm
So
41 years
thank you.
old and
It was great.
you're not owning up to it? I would rather go
She's
not
like,
about it
she's
than
like,
I
have
still
to
have a
face
question. What was
your.
the name of the poet
tyranny.
who wrote in response to the Gates bomb?
Paul Muldoon, Muldoon. I can send Dr. Holt the link to the poem.
Oh yeah, you do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Appreciate it. Bye. Yeah, so just we'll be working on it on campus. Okay. Okay.
Okay, I found you. Come back to the island.
I'm serious.
They never leave.
Family here and never.
That was like no.
So they
Okay. What? I am gonna sit over there though.
very like
Nobody else
Sorry,
is there. No, thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
I was super missing that, and I was so sad when I realized it. But we're gonna go
I don't like somebody's gonna attack me.
And it's horrible because people can see me going Pinterest all day. Yeah, Irish journalism.
Yeah, I really relate to that area a lot.
More comfortable writing.
I just can't keep up with the pace.
You're all gonna be.
Like I would 100% immediately do English.
You
major,
all
but I know.
will be English majors by the
I know that I can't keep my goals so
English
right all the English.
You, it's everybody has a pace.
Well,
Because they
don't
don't write
assign
all the
something to
time.
make you write it quickly?
No.
No.
No, they basically do it like we do it. So you get like a paper at the end of the semester. Were you?
What I really want to say.
Well, I wasn't sure. No, I was.
Who doesn't have 3 people at this
Just
table?
English. I'm gonna be that table.
Okay.
I'm going over there.
Alright. What I really want to do is do like a major in like relating between like books turn into movies and stuff like that.
Books turn that like people work on adaptation all the time.